first of a series of 3 videos on the periods of history. I'm making these because I'll be mentioning the names of lots of different periods in other videos on this channel, and I wanted to have one that explained what they are. The video isn't meant to be a short history of England or Britain or whatever. It's about the periods. So I'm going to mention lots of events and lots of people, but there will also be lots of important events that I haven't mentioned. The kings and queens feature more heavily than they really deserve to. The events and people that I mentioned in these videos are only the ones which are used to name or to divide up history into periods. Of course, this means that at some point someone has considered them to be important, but in many cases this was quite some time ago, and we wouldn't necessarily agree anymore. Like the rest of the videos on this channel, the focus will be upon British and especially English history, but I'll try as far as possible to put things in a European context at least. So this video itself will cover the Roman period to the end of the Middle Ages in about 1500. The next one will cover everything from the end of the Middle Ages to the present, and then a third will put these two into context by looking at prehistory, that is, everything that happened before there were written records. The yellow bar on the bottom of the screen represents the whole of British history, that is, the period in which there were written records. People had lived in Britain for thousands of years before this, that is, in prehistory, but because they didn't leave written records, they can't be studied using history. They can only be studied using archaeology, that is, the material objects and buildings which those people left behind. The red and purple bars represent things which were going on elsewhere in the world. The red is the Roman Empire, which had begun before history had begun in Britain, and the purple is the Byzantine Empire, which is what the eastern half of the Roman Empire became after Rome itself fell. The Byzantine Empire is often used as a period of history in the Mediterranean, i.e. the Byzantine period, so it's worth knowing how that relates to the periods of British history. The earliest written records relating to Britain are those of the Romans, who invaded in 43 AD, so typically this is when British history is considered to have begun. There were, of course, a few people who had written about Britain as a distant land before the Roman conquest, people like Julius Caesar, but altogether there isn't very much in the way of written records prior to the Roman conquest. The period in which the Romans ruled Britain is, logically, known as the Roman period, and it's represented here in red. Sometimes it's called the Romano-British period because a certain amount of Iron Age culture continues in spite of the Roman occupation. In some ways a little bit more like a proto-history, although it's not usually called that, because there aren't huge amounts of written material, there's not very much about specific places, and quite a lot of things are quite vague. And of course the Romans never conquered all of Scotland, and even in the parts of Scotland that they did conquer, they weren't there for very long, and likewise they never conquer Ireland, parts of Scandinavia, eastern parts of Germany, and points east of there, like modern Poland. In these places, prehistory continues alongside the Roman Empire, so that there is a pre-Roman Iron Age before the Roman Empire emerged elsewhere, a Roman Iron Age in which the Roman Empire neighboured these societies, and then a post-Roman Iron Age after the Roman Empire was no longer nearby. Now, traditionally, 410 AD is taken to be the end of Roman Britain, but in reality, the end of Roman Britain was a long, drawn-out process, and you couldn't really put a precise date on it. But 410 is a good shorthand. The Roman period is followed by the early medieval period, which we've coloured blue here. In the Mediterranean, North Africa, this is often called the late antique period because there's much more continuity with the Roman era than there is in Northern Europe. It also gets called the Anglo-Saxon period in England. Now, this isn't a very helpful term because the idea that Angles and Saxons came from what's now Germany and displaced the people that were in England is at the absolute best a gross oversimplification. Certainly lots of people were moving around, but lots of people also stayed, and the people who came weren't only Anglo-Saxons. The traditional story is essentially mythical, and it hides the fact that there are a lot of similarities between what was going on in Britain and what was going on in the rest of Europe, socially and culturally. It's also a little bit problematic because certain sections of the American right, including the extreme right, have adopted the term Anglo-Saxon to refer to themselves, which is ridiculous on the face of things. But it does seem to have stuck, and it's not likely to be a term we're going to reclaim, and it's not a very useful term anyway, so it's not a fight that's worth having. This is followed by the later medieval period, or the Middle Ages. Often if people simply say medieval, it's actually this period and not the early medieval period that they are talking about. And this is we've represented in orange. And then finally, from the end of the medieval period in the 15th century up to the present, archaeologists call it the post-medieval period and consider it one period. Historians tend to divide it into two: the early modern period up to about 1700 or 1750 AD, and the modern period in light blue from the end of the early modern period until today. So let's stretch out the timeline again, and also at the same time move to the left so that the early medieval period fills the screen. The early medieval period is itself divided into early, middle, and late phases. The early Saxon period, in sort of yellow-brown colour, stretches from the 5th century through to about the middle of the 7th century. And this is the period in which lots of people are migrating around Europe, particularly out of places that later became Germany. And so sometimes this gets referred to as the migration period. It has, historically at any rate, often been referred to as the Dark Ages because there's really very little historical source material for this period, but that terminology is quite old-fashioned because it's clear, even in spite of the lack of historical records, that this wasn't a period that was somehow primitive. The Middle Saxon period covers the mid-7th to the very beginning of the 9th century, represented here in magenta. And sometimes it's called, in Britain at any rate, the conversion period, because this is when Christian missionaries began to visit England to bring Christianity, and very specifically Roman Christianity, to the British Isles. And then finally, there's the late Saxon period, which runs from the beginning of the 9th century through to the middle of the 11th century. It's during the late Saxon period that the Vikings begin to turn up, initially raiding, later establishing kingdoms in the north and east of Britain and across most of Scotland. In areas that were Viking kingdoms, you'll often hear people speak of a Viking period, but that doesn't apply, of course, to the whole of the country, particularly in the southwest, where Anglo-Saxon kingdoms continued throughout the Viking period elsewhere. The Vikings get pushed out of the British Isles around a century or so, a little bit less, before the Norman Conquest. The Norman Conquest, 1066, begins the medieval period, so let's pull the timeline along again to line the medieval period up in the middle of the screen. So, as you said, it begins with the Norman Conquest, 1066. In Britain, it's sometimes called the medieval period, the Middle Ages. All these tend to refer usually to this particular period after the conquest, and in the rest of Europe, this period begins around about 1000 AD, give or take. And this is the first period in which we start to get really good sources for local history. So, Domesday Book in 1086, Manor Court Rolls from about the end of the 12th century AD. I find it useful to divide this period up into the time before and after the Black Death of 1348-49. The first half, which is yellow here, is sometimes called the High Middle Ages, and that after the late Middle Ages, represented here in red. The term High Middle Ages is used very loosely, though some people would associate it with particular cultural and artistic features and place it closer to 1300, so it's not a precise term. There are a couple of important sub-periods at the beginning of the Middle Ages. The very earliest part is often called the Norman period, from the Norman Conquest to the end of the reign of King Stephen in 1153, and after that, very occasionally, you'll come across references to the Angevin period, or Angevin England. And the reason for that is that towards the end of, or at the very end of the Norman period, there was a little civil war called the Anarchy from 1135 to 1153. And the settlement at the end of that merged the Norman kingdoms in England with some in northern France to form the Angevin Empire, and that continued until the end of the reign of King John. It's worth pointing out a couple of important wars that occurred during the Middle Ages. There's the 100 Years' War between England and France, which was between 1337 and 1453. And then, almost straight after that, England enters another period of civil war, which is often now known as the Wars of the Roses, between 1455 and about 1487. And indeed, the end of the Wars of the Roses, or perhaps the accession of the Tudor dynasty to the throne, is often considered the end of the Middle Ages in England. So that's enough for this video. The next one will cover everything from where we left off in this video up to the present day, which is the time in which many of the familiar bits of history, the Tudors or the Victorians, for instance, happened.